June 22, 1941, somewhere over the Ardennes, France. The early morning fog clung to the dense forests as Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes sliced through the gray sky. From the cockpit of a Heinkel H-111, Lieutenant Klaus Weber squinted at the sprawling western front below. The villages, the railways, the thin columns of tanks, all moving with precision, seemed almost surreal. The cold metal of his controls vibrated as the engines hummed, a constant reminder that Europe was on the brink, yet strangely calm. This was not the invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler had hesitated, or perhaps reconsidered entirely. Instead of turning his eyes eastward, his gaze remained fixed on consolidating power across Western Europe. The troops, positioned along the French border, were restless but ready. A quiet tension lingered over the continent. The Allies expected a German push, but the vast, snowy expanses of Russia remained untouched. From the German High Command in Berlin, maps were spread across oak tables, pins marking fortresses in France, Belgium, and the Low Countries. General Franz Halder ran a finger along the eastern border, a line that would have been the launch point of Operation Barbarossa. Now it was a line untouched, untested. No Eastern Front, no endless winters, no frozen mud, no millions of men lost to the vastness of Russia. Klaus Weber felt a strange weight in his chest. The soldiers under his command were trained for one type of war, a fast, decisive blitzkrieg across Europe. But now, with the eastern frontier dormant, they were free. Yet freedom was uneasy. The specter of overconfidence hung heavy, like smoke from a distant battlefield that had yet to ignite. Meanwhile, in London, intelligence officers scanned radio intercepts, puzzled. Germany's forces were moving with meticulous care westward, but nothing suggested the enormous eastern mobilization everyone had anticipated. Winston Churchill's office was filled with the low murmur of advisors speculating on Hitler's next move. Could the war end before the Soviet winter ever arrive? Could the balance of power in Europe shift in a single, unprecedented way? Across France, civilians went about their lives under occupation, sensing that something was different. The usual sounds of distant artillery were absent. Instead, there was a cautious calm. But beneath it lay the knowledge that Germany's decision not to strike eastward had ripple effects that no one could yet calculate. Factories churned out weapons, airfields buzzed with aircraft maintenance crews, and the Wehrmacht prepared. But for what, exactly? That question hung in the air like an unspoken threat. The world was poised on the edge of a knife. Without the colossal drain of manpower, supply lines, and brutal winters of the Soviet campaign, Germany had a chance, perhaps for the first time, to truly dominate Western Europe with full strength. And yet the choices of leaders, generals, and soldiers would decide whether that opportunity became victory or disaster.
June 23, 1941. The French countryside shimmered under the early summer sun, the shadows of oak trees stretching across quiet roads. Colonel Otto Reinhardt adjusted his binoculars, peering at the horizon where the columns of panzer divisions rumbled forward. In this alternate world, the Eastern Front did not exist. Every regiment, every tank, every soldier was available to strike deeper into Western Europe. The Belgian towns, once a buffer zone, were now under precise surveillance. Reinhardt's orders were clear: secure the key river crossings and advance with caution, but with speed unmatched by history. The Belgian and British forces, expecting Germany to be tied up in the Soviet wilderness, were caught off guard. Radar stations and reconnaissance planes reported movements too fast, too coordinated. The Allies were bewildered. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Hitler watched from the command bunker as reports flowed in. The absence of the Soviet front allowed for concentration of resources unimaginable in the original timeline. Fuel, ammunition, and soldiers, everything that had once been scattered across thousands of miles of frozen land, were now consolidated for one decisive thrust. The generals, while wary of overconfidence, could not hide their astonishment. The Wehrmacht was operating at full efficiency. In the skies above France, Luftwaffe fighter wings roared past, engaging small pockets of Allied resistance with lethal precision. Lieutenant Hans Meyer maneuvered his Messerschmitt Bf 109 through the flak and clouds, amazed at the lack of attrition his comrades suffered. No endless supply lines, no brutal winter campaigns in Russia. This was a war in which Germany could focus, adapt, and dominate. Across the Channel, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill's war room buzzed with unease. Intelligence reports indicated unprecedented German mobility. The RAF scrambled fighters, but the scale and coordination of the German advance was unlike anything they had anticipated. Churchill, pacing between maps, muttered under his breath, "If Hitler had devoted these forces eastward, we might have breathed a sigh of relief, but now we face a storm of concentrated power." Back on the ground, civilians witnessed armored divisions crossing borders with uncanny efficiency. In towns like Liège and Namur, locals peered from windows as tanks rolled past, soldiers marching in perfect formation. The absence of Eastern Front casualties meant more experienced officers leading younger troops, creating a formidable force that seemed unstoppable. Yet, amid this apparent advantage, a quiet tension lingered. Strategists in Berlin debated the long-term consequences. Could concentrating forces in the West provoke the United States to intervene earlier? Would Britain endure the pressure or crumble under relentless occupation? The Wehrmacht's unprecedented strength was a double-edged sword. While it promised rapid victories, it also painted an enormous target for the global powers watching Europe's unfolding drama. The world held its breath. In this alternate timeline, the war was no longer a two-front nightmare for Germany. It was a calculated gamble, a test of strategy, diplomacy, and sheer audacity. Every tank, every aircraft, and every soldier could tip the balance between historic triumph and catastrophic overreach.
July 2nd, 1941. London. The war room was filled with the low hum of telephones and hurried footsteps. Winston Churchill stood over a massive map of Europe, the red pins of German-occupied territories glaring like warnings. Reports from the field indicated the German divisions were moving faster and more cohesively than ever. Intelligence officers, accustomed to analyzing two-front warfare, were struggling to comprehend a Germany that had all its strength focused westward. Air raid sirens wailed sporadically across southern England, though they carried a different note than usual, more warning than destruction. Fighter squadrons of the RAF scrambled to intercept reconnaissance planes, only to find themselves outmaneuvered and outnumbered. The German Luftwaffe, free from commitments in the east, dominated the skies with near-perfect coordination. Squadron leader James Harrington adjusted his headset, frustration etched on his face. It's like they've been waiting for this moment, every plane, every pilot perfectly in position. Across the Channel, German divisions pressed into northern France and the Low Countries. Colonel Reinhardt observed the disciplined columns advancing with almost surgical precision. Villages surrendered without a fight, roads were secured in hours instead of days, and strategic positions previously considered strongholds fell one by one. In this timeline, there were no attrition-weary units from a brutal Eastern campaign, no frozen supply lines, no exhausted soldiers crawling through snow. The Wehrmacht was at its most formidable. Back in London, Churchill convened an emergency cabinet meeting. Advisors debated contingency plans, their voices rising in alarm.
If Germany is free to concentrate its forces, we cannot rely on attrition to slow them down, one officer warned. We must reconsider our strategies, accelerate training, expand our air defenses, and perhaps even pressure the Americans into direct involvement sooner than planned. The realization hit hard. The war might be lost not due to military inferiority, but because Germany had undivided focus and resources. Meanwhile, in the occupied territories, civilians sensed the difference. Towns that had once endured sporadic skirmishes now witnessed coordinated military precision. Farmers whispered in markets, soldiers in crisp uniforms marching past, and engineers constructing fortifications with alarming speed. News of rapid German advances traveled quickly, shaking the morale of both civilians and local resistance groups. Even within Germany, not everyone was comfortable with the new reality. Some generals feared that concentrating all forces in the West might provoke the United States or galvanize Britain into unprecedented alliances. Still, Hitler remained resolute. The Eastern Front would remain untouched, the Soviet Union a distant, ominous presence that had not yet drawn Germany into another quagmire. It was a gamble, a bet on timing, strategy, and the psychological impact of absolute military focus. The stage was set. The Allies were in shock, the German war machine at peak efficiency, and Europe teetered on the edge of a new, unpredictable reality. Every movement, every decision could cascade into outcomes that would reshape history. The question lingered. Could Germany maintain this advantage without overextending itself? Or would the absence of an Eastern Front merely delay an inevitable confrontation?
August 15, 1941, Washington, D.C. The corridors of power buzzed with a tense mixture of disbelief and urgency. President Franklin D. Roosevelt examined the latest intelligence reports, his finger tracing German positions on the map. Without the Eastern Front, Germany's armies were fully concentrated in the West, their operational tempo faster than anyone in Allied command had anticipated. The situation demanded a recalibration of American strategy and perhaps an acceleration of military production to meet a threat far greater than what had originally unfolded. Across Europe, the absence of a Soviet campaign had freed German engineers to enhance tanks, aircraft, and artillery at an unprecedented pace. In Berlin, factories hummed day and night, producing Panther tanks, Messerschmitts, and new artillery designs at rates that had historically been impossible. The Luftwaffe, no longer stretched thin, coordinated large-scale sorties with surgical efficiency. Every aircraft that left the runway carried the weight of a potentially decisive war, its pilots keenly aware that their focus was undiluted by the eastern wastelands. Meanwhile, Britain faced a strategic nightmare. Ports and industrial centers along the southern coast braced for intensified attacks. Winston Churchill, pacing the floor of his war room, understood that Germany's undivided attention could overwhelm defenses that had previously been bolstered by Soviet distraction. "This is a new war," he murmured almost to himself, "a war without an Eastern Front, and every advantage is in their hands." RAF commanders scrambled to optimize fighter deployments, yet every sortie seemed a reaction to a preemptively perfected German strategy. In occupied France and the Low Countries, civilians and resistance networks were acutely aware of the change in dynamics. Where sabotage might have once slowed the Wehrmacht's advance, the sheer coordination and availability of forces made disruption almost impossible. Underground leaders whispered, fearing that the usual attrition that had aided them would never materialize. Villages, towns, and rail lines fell faster than expected, leaving only pockets of resistance, as if the continent itself had been tilted in Germany's favor. Even within Germany, cracks in the facade of confidence appeared. Some generals worried about the political ramifications of this alternate strategy. With no Eastern distraction, Hitler's decision not to invade the USSR was being watched closely by neutral nations. Could Germany leverage this position to force Britain into negotiation? Could they deter American intervention, or would the concentration of power only invite a global backlash? The very absence of the Eastern Front introduced uncertainties of a new kind, strategic, political, and moral, that had no precedent in recorded history. The world had changed overnight. By sparing the Soviet Union, Germany had not just avoided millions of casualties, it had reshaped the trajectory of the entire war. Every victory, every advance in the West carried the weight of potential global consequence. And yet, the gamble remained. Undivided might could either secure uncontested dominance or ignite an unforeseen chain of events that would eventually engulf the world in conflict of a different, perhaps even greater scale.
September 10, 1941. Deep inside a sprawling industrial complex outside Berlin, the air smelled of hot metal and burning fuel. Engineers and factory workers labored tirelessly, constructing machines that had previously been rationed for Eastern campaigns. Panther tanks rolled off the assembly lines at record speed, their armor reinforced, engines tuned, and crews trained without the strain of continuous battle. Every innovation that had once been slowed by attrition, logistical nightmares, and frostbite-ravaged soldiers was now implemented in full. Colonel Reinhardt walked through the assembly hall, his boots clanging against the polished concrete. He observed engineers testing experimental anti-tank guns and new aircraft designs, the sound of hammers and machines blending into a mechanical symphony of war. "We've never had such focus," he murmured to a junior officer. "Every resource, every mind devoted to making us unstoppable in the West." The absence of the Eastern Front had inadvertently created a laboratory for military perfection, a Wehrmacht unbroken, untested in Russia, yet sharpened like a blade. In Paris, German strategists reviewed maps with meticulous care. Without the necessity of defending a sprawling eastern border, they could plan complex, multi-pronged offensives into Britain, the Low Countries, and even Italy. Supply lines were shorter, troops rested and well-fed, and artillery positioned precisely to obliterate strategic targets. Luftwaffe pilots flew training sorties daily, refining tactics that had only been theoretical in the real timeline. Every victory was magnified, every mistake was costly yet manageable, and the Wehrmacht operated as a machine honed to perfection. Meanwhile, intelligence networks in London and Washington scrambled to keep pace. The Allies were forced to adapt not only to a faster, more cohesive Germany, but also to the sheer technological advancements now at their disposal. Radar stations picked up new aircraft formations. Codebreakers analyzed new operational patterns. Research teams accelerated the development of advanced weapons in response to the German advantage. Every day, it became increasingly clear the war had tilted in a direction no one had anticipated. But the very efficiency of Germany's concentrated power carried hidden dangers. Strategists in Berlin debated whether concentrating all forces westward could provoke the United States to intervene sooner, or inspire Britain to rally even more determined resistance. Could this unprecedented focus, while creating immediate tactical advantages, inadvertently ignite a global coalition stronger than the one Germany had faced in actual history? The question lingered in the air, like the metallic scent of the factories themselves, powerful, promising, and perilous. Soldiers, engineers, and commanders alike sensed that they were living in a war that had no precedent. Every tank, plane, and division was a testament to what could be achieved when nothing distracted Germany from its Western ambitions. And yet, beneath the surface of this seemingly unstoppable machine, subtle threads of tension and uncertainty wove through strategy rooms and command bunkers alike. Victory was within reach, but at what cost and in what unforeseen ways would history be reshaped? October 5th, 1941, London. The city hummed with the uneasy rhythm of wartime vigilance. Anti-aircraft guns rumbled in the distance, but the danger was no longer limited to sporadic Luftwaffe raids. Germany, unburdened by the Eastern Front, had intensified its strategic bombing campaigns, targeting industrial hubs, airfields, and supply depots with unprecedented precision. Winston Churchill stood at the window of 10 Downing Street, peering out as smoke curled above factories in the distance, a stark reminder that Germany's full attention was now trained on the West. RAF squadrons scrambled continuously, yet each sortie felt like a reaction to a preemptive German strategy. Pilots like Flight Lieutenant Edward Thompson found themselves engaged in high-speed dogfights over the Channel, facing formations of Messerschmitts that executed complex maneuvers previously unimaginable. "It's as if they've been preparing for this exact moment," he muttered into his radio, adrenaline and fear mingling in his voice. Civilians in Britain noticed a change too. Air raid warnings came earlier and more frequently. Factories operated under blackout conditions, and rationing intensified as resources were diverted to support the war effort. The population braced for a long, uncertain struggle. Every citizen, from dock worker to engineer, felt the weight of a Germany capable of deploying its full might westward, without the drain of the Eastern Front. In Berlin, the German High Command watched with measured satisfaction. Tactical reports indicated that Britain's defenses were strained, yet adaptive. While Hitler celebrated the apparent advantage, advisors cautioned that overconfidence could be dangerous. Concentrating power in the West left Germany vulnerable in subtle ways. Logistical overstretch, potential diplomatic isolation, and the looming possibility of American intervention remained ever-present threats. Across the Atlantic, President Roosevelt accelerated the production of aircraft carriers, bombers, and tanks, anticipating that the moment when the United States would be forced into direct conflict could arrive sooner than in history. Intelligence briefings emphasized Germany's unprecedented coordination, and the fear that Britain might collapse under sustained pressure became a focal point for strategic planning. Every decision in Washington now carried the weight of preventing a Europe completely dominated by the Wehrmacht. Meanwhile, spies and resistance networks in occupied France and the Low Countries worked feverishly. The absence of a Russian front meant that German patrols were stronger, faster, and better equipped. Yet the spirit of resistance endured, fueled by the knowledge that all Germany's focus had created both opportunity and vulnerability. Small victories in sabotage and intelligence gathering now held more weight, as any disruption could ripple across the concentrated German war machine. As autumn settled over Europe, it became clear that the absence of the Eastern Front had fundamentally transformed the war. Germany's military, untested in Russia, was stronger than ever, but each calculated move now carried profound strategic and moral implications. The continent waited, breath held, for the next decisive clash, a confrontation that could determine the fate of millions and reshape history entirely.
November 12, 1941, Washington, D.C. The corridors of the White House were alive with tension, the hum of typewriters and telephones punctuating urgent conversations. President Franklin D. Roosevelt pored over reports from Europe, tracing German movements on maps spread across the cabinet table. Intelligence suggested that Germany, unburdened by the vast expanses of the Soviet Union, had concentrated its forces entirely on the Western Front. The situation was alarming. The Wehrmacht was not only stronger, but strategically optimized in a way never seen before.
Military advisors debated the options, their voices a mix of urgency and caution. General George C. Marshall leaned over the map, tapping points along the Atlantic coast and Western Europe. If Germany maintains this focus, Britain might fall before we can intervene effectively, he warned. We must accelerate production, ships, aircraft, and armored divisions before the Axis can consolidate power. Roosevelt nodded, aware that every day of hesitation increased the risk of a German-dominated Europe. Meanwhile, German intelligence monitored Atlantic communications closely. They understood that the United States, though not yet formally at war, was increasingly mobilizing to counter any potential German threat. Hitler, confident in the Wehrmacht's strength, debated internally whether early engagement with the U.S. could be delayed, leveraged diplomatically, or even avoided entirely. Yet even within the Führer's inner circle, some generals expressed concern. The concentration of forces westward might provoke a premature, overwhelming response from the Americans. Back in occupied Europe, the ramifications of this alternate strategy became visible in everyday life. Factories operated at peak efficiency, train lines hummed with logistical precision, and armored divisions moved like clockwork. Civilians, though fearful, noticed a new rhythm. The war felt both immediate and inevitable, as if the full force of Germany's might was pressing upon the continent with unrelenting precision. Resistance networks adapted, focusing on high-impact sabotage that could exploit even small cracks in the Wehrmacht's otherwise flawless operations. In Berlin, Churchill convened with senior commanders. "We are witnessing the consequences of one monumental decision," he stated. "Without the Eastern Front, Germany's full strength is against us. Every city, every factory, every port is a target. We must act swiftly, and we must assume that American intervention could be our only hope." RAF pilots trained harder, naval convoys became more tightly coordinated, and civilians endured blackouts and rationing, all while knowing the Wehrmacht's attention was entirely focused on their homeland. In Berlin, the sense of triumph was tempered by caution. Hitler and his generals understood that unchecked power brought new risks. Concentrating all military might in the West meant that any miscalculation could have disastrous consequences. Supply lines, political maneuvering, and intelligence gaps were all magnified under the weight of total focus. And yet, the Wehrmacht moved forward with a confidence that history had never seen, a force at its peak, marching toward a Europe that had never before experienced such unified precision. The world teetered on the edge. Every strategic choice, from Washington to London, from Berlin to the occupied territories, would ripple outward, shaping a conflict fundamentally different from the one history recorded. The absence of the Eastern Front had given Germany unprecedented opportunity, but also exposed vulnerabilities that could determine the fate of millions.
December 3rd, 1941, Berlin. The command bunker was alive with quiet urgency, punctuated by the shuffling of papers, the low murmur of officers, and the distant hum of machinery from factories beyond the city. Hitler stood over a large table, maps sprawled across its surface, red pins marking every territory controlled by the Wehrmacht. The Eastern Front had never materialized, and with that absence came both power and unease. The generals were uneasy, unaccustomed to wielding such unbroken strength without a drawn-out, exhausting campaign. General Wilhelm Keitel, always meticulous, voiced his concerns. "Mein Führer, concentrating all forces westward gives us tremendous opportunity, yes, but it also magnifies our exposure. Supply lines may appear secure, but a single misstep, a single miscalculation could unravel our advantage." His words, though cautious, echoed a tension few dared to speak aloud. Hitler's gaze did not waver. He had long cultivated absolute confidence. Yet even he could not entirely dismiss the whispers of doubt that moved silently through his inner circle. In the barracks, soldiers felt the strain of expectation. Unlike the Eastern Campaign, which tested endurance against harsh winters and vast distances, this war demanded perfection at every step. Mistakes were costly, but the opportunity for glory was unprecedented. Corporal Dieter Vogel wrote letters home, describing the eerie efficiency of the Wehrmacht, trained men, advanced tanks and air support operating flawlessly. Yet beneath his pride was a nagging awareness that such concentrated power carried unforeseen consequences, not just on the battlefield, but across Europe. Beyond strategy rooms and barracks, the moral weight of occupation pressed on commanders and civilian administrators alike. With no Eastern Campaign consuming manpower, Germany's forces were free to enforce occupation with ruthless efficiency. Decisions about governance, collaboration, and repression carried heavier consequences. Every choice in Belgium, France, and the Low Countries was amplified by the full strength of the Wehrmacht, creating ethical dilemmas that commanders had never faced at this scale. Even industrial leaders in Berlin felt the tension. Factories ran at maximum capacity, producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery, yet engineers and planners worried about long-term sustainability. Could Germany maintain this pace without exhausting the nation's resources? Could overconfidence, born from short-term success, lead to catastrophic misjudgments? Every innovation, every new weapon was a double-edged sword, offering advantage, but also increasing the risk of global retaliation. Outside Berlin, civilians sensed a war intensifying, not through attrition, but through concentrated force. Cities were quieter, yet the movement of troops and machinery was omnipresent. Resistance networks, though weakened by the efficiency of German occupation, persisted in small but significant acts of defiance. Their existence was a reminder that even in a seemingly unstoppable war machine, human resilience and unpredictability remained potent forces. As winter approached, Germany's leaders and soldiers alike understood that history had diverged dramatically. The absence of the Eastern Front had granted unmatched opportunity, but it had also magnified the consequences of every decision, every misstep, every moral compromise. In this new reality, every victory, every advance, and every innovation would shape the continent in ways no one could fully predict.
January 18th, 1942, northern France. Snow blanketed the countryside, muting the roar of armored columns and the steady march of infantry. Colonel Reinhardt surveyed the front lines, his breath visible in the freezing air, hands wrapped tightly around his binoculars. The Wehrmacht, untested by the grueling Eastern Front, had perfected its coordination, moving with a speed and efficiency that stunned both officers and soldiers alike. Villages that had once resisted now capitulated almost immediately, and supply lines functioned seamlessly, stretching confidence across the Allies. In London, the situation was grim. Churchill convened with military advisors, his voice taut with urgency. Germany is unrelenting. Every city, every factory is within their reach, and they advance with a coordination we have never seen before. RAF squadrons were deployed to cover retreating convoys and industrial centers, but the Luftwaffe's air superiority made every sortie a perilous gamble. Fighter pilots like Flight Lieutenant Edward Thompson pushed their machines to the limit, dogfighting over snowy fields as German bombers targeted ports and critical infrastructure. Across the Atlantic, Roosevelt faced mounting pressure to act.
The U.S. Navy accelerated convoy escorts, and military planners devised strategies to supply Britain and prepare for direct involvement. The concentrated German forces posed a threat unlike any that had existed in the previous timeline. There was no eastern drain, no attrition from the vast Russian expanse. Every advance, every calculated maneuver by the Wehrmacht threatened to force Britain into surrender or compel immediate U.S. intervention. Back in Berlin, Hitler and his generals observed the unfolding Western campaign with a mix of satisfaction and apprehension. Successes mounted rapidly, yet concerns about overextension and political fallout persisted. Could Germany maintain this advantage without provoking a full-scale American response? What would happen if Britain resisted longer than anticipated? Every strategic decision carried monumental weight, amplified by the absence of a two-front war. Meanwhile, civilians in occupied territories witnessed the power of concentrated German might. Trains arrived on time, factories churned out weapons without delay, and soldiers enforced occupation with terrifying efficiency. Resistance networks adapted, sabotaging supply lines wherever possible, yet the full strength of the Wehrmacht left little room for error. Their persistence reminded German commanders that even the most disciplined and powerful force could not completely eliminate uncertainty. As winter tightened its grip, Europe felt the tension of a continent poised on the brink. The Wehrmacht's precision, the Allies' scramble to respond, and the potential for American intervention created a delicate equilibrium. Every tank, every aircraft, every calculated move could tip the scales toward decisive German dominance or trigger a counterstrike that would reshape the war once more. In this timeline, the absence of the Eastern Front had not removed danger, it had concentrated it, sharpening the stakes for all who moved within its shadow.
February 3, 1942, Norfolk, Virginia. The docks were alive with activity, ships being loaded with tanks, planes, and supplies destined for Britain. Admiral Ernest King paced the deck of a command cruiser, the salty wind whipping at his coat as he oversaw the mobilization of men and material. The intelligence reports were stark. Germany, unburdened by the Eastern Front, had concentrated its full military power in the West. Britain needed immediate support, and the United States had no choice but to escalate its involvement sooner than anyone had planned. Across the Atlantic, convoys braved U-boat-infested waters with new urgency. Every ship carried not only weapons, but the hope of counterbalancing the Wehrmacht's extraordinary efficiency. The concentration of German forces in Western Europe meant that Britain could not hold alone, and every American convoy represented a lifeline in a war now defined by speed, precision, and calculated strategy. In Berlin, the news of U.S. mobilization triggered both confidence and concern. Hitler, reviewing reports from the front, smiled at the early victories: France fully under control, Belgium pacified, and the Low Countries tightly secured. Yet his generals whispered warnings of overreach. Concentrating all forces westward had created a formidable machine, but it also painted a target, an industrially capable United States preparing to strike, a Britain that would not easily yield, and the looming threat of a global coalition against the Reich. Meanwhile, Britain rallied with renewed vigor. Factories operated around the clock, RAF pilots trained relentlessly, and the Royal Navy repositioned its assets for maximum defense and counterattack. Civilians endured rationing, blackouts, and the constant threat of air raids, yet morale remained stubbornly high. "They may be stronger, faster, and more organized," muttered Air Marshal Arthur Harris, "but determination and strategy can counter raw force. Every mistake Germany makes, we will exploit." On the ground, German soldiers felt the subtle shift in reality. The war, once predictable in its pacing, now carried the uncertainty of U.S. intervention.
Officers like Colonel Reinhardt noted how the arrival of American supplies, weapons, and eventually troops could tip the balance. For the first time, even the most confident commanders sensed that absolute efficiency in Western Europe might not guarantee victory. The stage for a global confrontation was set. Germany's decision not to invade the Soviet Union had granted unparalleled operational freedom, yet it had also accelerated the engagement of the United States. The war's dynamics had shifted, and the concentrated German force now faced a coalition strengthened not by time, but by the necessity of survival. Every decision, every battle, and every innovation would carry consequences not just for Europe, but for the world.
March 14, 1942, Northern France. The Wehrmacht, at the height of its strength, advanced with unprecedented coordination. Tanks rolled across fields as artillery pounded strategic targets, while Luftwaffe bombers created a constant, oppressive roar in the sky. Soldiers felt a mixture of exhilaration and unease. Never before had they operated with such efficiency, yet never before had they faced the full weight of strategic expectation without the mitigating distractions of the Eastern Front. Colonel Reinhardt observed the progress with a trained eye. Every division was precisely where it needed to be, every supply line intact, every communication secure. Yet even he could not ignore the subtle cracks that were beginning to appear. Minor logistical delays, fatigue among the troops, and the growing awareness that the Allies were adapting. The absence of an Eastern Front had given Germany power, but it had also magnified the consequences of any misstep. In Berlin, Hitler's inner circle debated strategy late into the night. The generals presented conflicting reports. Some advocated pressing the advantage relentlessly. Others cautioned against overextension. Concentrated power is a double-edged sword, General Keitel warned. Every advance stretches our lines, and with the Americans now mobilizing, we cannot assume victory is guaranteed. Hitler, confident yet wary, considered the weight of history unfolding in a way no one had anticipated. Meanwhile, British and American forces coordinated more closely than ever. Intelligence reports suggested weak points in German supply lines, and planners prepared for combined counteroffensives. RAF raids targeted critical factories, while American convoys arrived with tanks, aircraft, and materiel, creating pressure points the Wehrmacht could no longer ignore. For the first time, German soldiers and officers alike sensed that efficiency alone might not secure the war. Civilians across occupied territories bore witness to the consequences of absolute focus. Villages near